Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening, good evening. We're still waiting for some people, but I do like to get started when we say we're going to, so we're going to get started. First of all, Penny and I are really pleased you could come out tonight, and I'm going to remind you to turn off your phones and other distracting electronic devices. The format tonight is pretty simple. A brief introduction, and then our guest will have the floor. And after the talk, there's cookies and lemonade at the front counter, along with the books. And Henry and Dan are going to stay back here to sign the book, so we can spread out. If you see me moving chairs, leaning them against the wall, it's not to rush you out. It's just to make room for everybody to stand around, visit, whatever. We do have a lot coming up. The best way to not miss something is to sign up for the bookstore's newsletter or check our website. But just briefly, next Wednesday we are launching Charles Whelan's new book. He's known for his Naked Economics series of books. Well, he has a new novel coming, and it's quite the page turner. It goes on sale on Tuesday, and he'll be here Wednesday. And 2 weeks from tonight, Laura Waterman, who you know is an adventuress, has a new novel, her first novel. And then 3 weeks from tonight, there's another Norwich author who has a new novel. And 4 weeks from tonight, Nicholas Christakis, who has a book that's called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of Good Society, which has been getting a lot of media. He lives here in town, and he'll be speaking about that book in a month. But I wanted to also mention, I won't go into all the others that are going on, but in the art-related world, figuring I had a captive audience tonight, I wanted to mention that Suzanne Hinman, who is a historian, it has a book coming that's called The Grandest Madison Square Garden, Art, Scandal, and Architecture in the Gilded Age, New York. And it's the one that was featured in the Valley News, I think it was last week. Well, the book isn't even out yet. But when it is out, she is giving a talk that we're co-sponsoring with the Hood Museum June 20th? Yeah, I think it's June 20th. But stay tuned for that. So, tonight, we have two people here. They've been amusing us for a while. It's been quite the afternoon. Henry Isaacs is known to many of us. He lived in the Upper Valley for years. And actually, the space where you guys are sitting was his gallery at one point in time, for a very short moment. Then we took it over. That was more than 20 years ago. And for the past dozen or so years, Henry and his wife Donna have been living in Maine, and they're returning to the Upper Valley, which we're very excited about.
Nice.
He's a graduate of Kany School, and he earned his BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. And in the early 80s, he did graduate work at the Slade School of Fine Art at the University College in London. He's taught drawing, painting, and printmaking locally and around Europe. And as you'll learn with tonight's book, he's been traveling around the world. His work is in many, many, many private and public collections. This new book, Travel Notes, Paintings by Henry Isaacs, was created by Daniel Kany. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yes. Rhymes with zany.
He's an art historian, a critic, a curator, a musician, and a writer. He studied at Bowdoin College and Johns Hopkins University and has published numerous award-winning articles and critiques. And without further ado, please help me welcome our guest.
Thank you. You want me to start?
Absolutely.
Okay. This is the book is about Henry, and this is Henry's peeps and Henry's area. So, of course, we're going to start with me. Why not? I want to say just a couple of things. We're gonna talk about the book and Henry's work and all of that. This is a bookstore, though, so I imagine that a lot of you are sort of prose people, you know, books and reading and all that stuff. And so I hope we can incorporate a little bit more of that than we usually would. You know, usually we're, like in Maine, we're talking more to art audiences, like very specifically dedicated and focused on the visual arts. So, you know, prose is interesting. Writing about art is very complicated. It's difficult for a lot of people because you're trying to balance sort of like the subjectivity of the artist with the subjectivity of the audience, and then sort of the culture in general. and you're using words to sort of discuss how to think about non-verbal things like art. And to do that in a balanced way where you're not pretending like the words own the ideas, because actually the point of visual art and a lot of music, for example, is to do the opposite, to make sure that the forms and the content is what's driving the ideas and not the words, not the descriptions, not this sort of like simple symbolic, verbal brouhaha that we're tossing around right now. So I do want to be able to fit that in a little bit, but what the book is about is it's going to be a chapter of a much larger work. And Henry is a pretty interesting artist. He paints everywhere he goes. He doesn't work from photographs. He makes these sort of very quick sketches. Some look like finished paintings, and others look like this. Everywhere he goes, all the time. He does this on any given day. Henry actually performed my wedding last August, and after the wedding, after the ceremony, he didn't come and join the party per se. He sat down and began to paint. So that's how he works. So we're going to go into this, and so let's hear what Henry has to say about how we want to get this ball rolling.
About 2 years ago, maybe it's 3 now, it's hard to understand how long ago it was.
Take it, pass it on.
I was diagnosed with something still unknown to me. And this book started out in friendship. Dan and I have known each other since Dan has been reviewing my work for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And I was fairly incapacitated by some kind of brain disease. And Dan started interviewing me. Hundreds of hours of interviews. Hundreds. And one winter's day in Portland, he said, "Well, what have you been doing?" I think that might have been 2 years ago. And I brought him up to my studio, which he had been, and I said, "Well, I don't really have a lot to show for myself, just these sort of chicken scratches. This is what I had. They're dry. Don't worry too much. They're not too contagious." But he said, "Well, why don't you put them out on the floor of your studio and I'll come and take a look." And I have a fairly large barn-like structure, and I put them out, and they covered 1,200 square feet. And he came upstairs the next morning, and I kind of hobble around with a cane or worse. And he came to the top of the stairs, and I wish I had a photograph of his expression. And his jaw dropped, and I said, "Well, I do have more." And he said, "Okay." And he didn't say a word and gathered up about 50 of these things and made a stack of them, and that was the beginnings of this little book. He came back and we talked and we talked, and hundreds more hours went by, and I finished those, and by now, 2 years later, I've finished a couple hundred of these things. And then there was an exhibition, and then there were far too many of these paintings.
This is what the finished ones look like.
And these resulted in my producing these little paintings. For those of you who are familiar with my work, you can pass these around as well. I rarely show work in this scale. Most of my work, mostly I use these to just take notes and on the way to doing a larger scale image. They're just what I do. I am a painter, and somebody told me that if I'm a painter, I'm supposed to be painting. So I always have a backpack wherever I am, and I pull out paint and brushes, and probably some of you have been forced to paint with me. And whether you are a Buddhist monk in Nepal or a child in Guatemala, you've ended up painting with me on little tiny panels. So Dan left that first day with this mess on the floor. Donna came upstairs, and her reaction was, well, I hope he comes back and helps you clean up. And he did. But what this has become has been such a lovely collaboration of author and artist. We love to talk, we love to joke around, we love to argue.
No, we don't.
He's slowly getting the idea that I'm funnier, and I am absolutely always right. The flaying of Marsyas, the definitive flaying of Marsyas, was done by Rubens.
Titian.
And he's come a long way over the last several years. Dan, unique to many art critics, is an art historian and writes from a store of knowledge that is very impressive. And while sometimes I disagree, it's what always hooked me to his work. And it is wonderful to come home to Liza and Penny's store, where Liza reminds me that she first met my children when my youngest, anyway, was 2 or 3.
3.
And do you see what my life is like?
Oh, she held up the 3 in the back. Sold. Sold.
And so I would inhabit this place, and I would buy some of the books, but more often I would read the books. And so whatever went on in here, I think that I paint because I don't know how to put things into words. So with not much more to say, thank you to Liza and Penny. I'm glad to be home, and thank you to Dan.
Okay, most of what he said was absolutely incorrect. He was pretty good on the facts. Henry is a great storyteller. And one of the things that probably knits most of the people in this room together is our sort of inclination, our propensity for enjoying stories. You know, whether it's books or anecdotes, a good conversation. Henry is a big reader, and it's funny because I just had this image of like back in the day, 20 years ago, I imagine there were a lot of sort of cadmium yellow fingerprints in some of the pages. It's probably pretty cool. And a lot of the way that this sort of book project came about, and in some ways this book would be a chapter of a larger book, and it gets at Henry's working process. Alone, standalone, it's very interesting because Henry doesn't work like most artists. And he doesn't think about the content of his work like a lot of artists do. There are stories, and you know, it's interesting because a simple landscape, you know, we think of a landscape as sort of a non-narrative thing. It's a transportive, there and then experience where, you know, the viewer will look at the image and be transported to sort of like that spot and place in time where the painter sort of sets the stage. But Henry's pieces happen in public space, and this is one of the most important things about sort of culture in general. And it's not the easiest thing to sort of discuss because, again, we're talking about subjectivity of the audience, the viewer, the culture, the artist. Henry will go out and work in places like Nepal or on the coast of Maine or here, and he'll welcome people to be with him because art, in a lot of ways, culture takes place in a public space. Cultural space is a public shared space. And a lot of people understand sort of painting to be this sort of thing that happens in private, you know, like the post-war American myth of art, which is, it's very problematic, but it's like the most common way a person in America is going to talk about art now, which is this idea that, you know, the authenticity, the content, the important stuff of like painting comes from like, you know, the like personal, creative, individual soul of the artist who struggles, you know, to express his genius, you know, through the materials. And, you know, that's a cop-out in a lot of ways, because if that's the actual content of the work, it's only for that artist. And there's no sort of cultural engagement. There's nothing behind it. You don't have to know history. Your development of your sensibilities doesn't help you. You know, as we all know from reading, the more books you read, the more you find common shared space, common languages, how a phrase is turned, references, you know, to other things, structures that make sense, expectations, how these play out. And so it's a lot more interesting when you're engaged with other people. And so Henry will go out and work in a spot, and people will come up and see him. He'll go, you know, paint in Guatemala, and there's a volcano at the end of the street, and he'll say, the volcano at the end of the street, and we're actually talking about, you know, it's a reference to a Neil Gaiman book, right? Mm-hmm. The ocean at the end of the lane, what is it? Mm-hmm. Something, okay. So the ideas are shared. And the idea of the content, the idea of sort of like our being here, you know, how when you paint a painting, you go to a museum, you put it up, like the idea of the public, it really matters, the audience. And that's where culture happens. Culture doesn't happen, you know, some guy alone in a studio just having an idea. He has to do something with it. It has to be shared. It has to be sort of performed in a public space and comprehended. You know, it's one thing. Like when nobody in this room can say who definitively painted like the first abstract painting in Western art history, because we don't know. In other ways, what's more important is that we don't care. Because what matters is not that somebody painted an abstract painting, but that that painting could be seen as a painting, even though it was abstract, even though it didn't have like legible content, it didn't have a recognizable object. And so for people to say, that's painting and that's what's happening, that's a cultural achievement. That's a societal achievement. That isn't sort of what an individual is doing. And that stuff really matters. So like there's a reason why abstract painting happened at one moment, like around the world. You know, Arthur Dove in the US and Delaunay in Paris and Kandinsky and Mondrian and Kupka in the Czech Republic and Bala. This is all within like a year. And so that it's funny because you'd think, oh, this would be like, you know, if you had one sort of achievement to check off in your art history resume, that would be it. But that isn't how it works. So moving forward, the idea of sort of engagement and storytelling is fundamental. And I'm sounding like a dry nerd with this thing in my hand, I'm sorry, but Henry's hilarious, and the stories that happen in the book are hilarious, and sort of like how the engagement happens. Like, you know, he's telling me the story about when he was teaching at the Slade in London, you know, the Queen Mother got stuck in an elevator. And there was just a little crack there. And as the junior sort of American on the staff, it was his assignment basically to hang out with her and her assistant and, for hours until the engineers came and fixed the thing. He was on his way to go have a drink with Castro and
Different country.
Cuba. Cuba.
Just
right?
have to clarify.
And Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he's on his way.
Yeah.
The
Queen Mother wasn't invited.
Are you sure?
Well, I forgot to invite her.
Magical realism. We can retell this story as no. Okay,
Yeah.
True story. So this guy is
Both are
on.
true, yeah.
This guy is on his way in Cuba to go have a drink with Castro and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he's looking at the gas meter, which of course is en español, and it's not moving. It gets really good mileage until it didn't, and he was out of gas because it was actually the temperature gauge. True story. So Jacques Derrida is on the bus, and Henry's with his wild partying group of American cronies, and the black-caped French philosophes are grumpily sitting up front. Bus has to stop because there's a pack of wild turkeys? Wild turkeys blocking the road.
Vultures.
Vultures. And not turkey vultures, which are pretty cool.
In the bus and outside the bus.
In the bus and outside the bus. Bus driver stops, sizes up the situation, decides to just gun it and go through. Apparently the whole thing is all just blood and gore, and Derrida never smiled once, nor joined them to drink their cheap rum. This is what this art book is about.
It's true, but doesn't that happen to everybody? The thing is that I'm constantly, I get presents, birthday presents. My sister loves to send presents. This is a bookstore, so I will be careful because I don't want to hurt anybody's sales, but of late, some very kind and lovely friends have written books about painters. They're New York Times bestsellers, and they're dreadful. They're dreadful. They talk about, can you hand me that dreadful book?
The dreadful one? I mean, that's like a whole...
No.
Yeah.
The one I wrote.
Can you hold this for a sec?
No. I also wrote a dreadful book. But the problem is that novelists,
Screw everything up. It's
I
kinda my thing.
believe, by and large, do not know how to write about artists. And I cannot wait to catch up with a couple of friends who have written about artists and these people don't make a fortune, but they have gotten plenty of mileage, and I'll whisper in your ears outside of this meeting, but they talk about some famous artists will walk into a room and say, "Oh, the light in here. I've never seen such a light. I just have to paint." And the artist gets down to work. "Oh, the light is spectacular." Okay. Things like that. So, I'm capable of writing drivel like that. So, in 1996, this just shows you that I'm just as bad. I took a job for the 1996 Ambassador's Ball, 40th anniversary of the founding or something of the State of Israel. This is the only work. Now, everybody here is sworn to secrecy. If anybody mentions this, You know, what happens in the Norwich bookstore stays in the Norwich bookstore, okay? All right. I did these, this is the only work that I've ever done with, that I did not do on site. I've never been to Israel, and so at that time, I'm sure the times have changed in the last 20 years, but there was exactly one book in the Norwich Public Library, and it on Israel. It was a photographic aerial view of Israel. And so I did the ant thing, whereas I imagined myself down, and I did these pastel drawings. And to seal the deal, I had to write something, and I wrote the following: landscapes from Israel. What remains in my memory is magic. A single image of an irrigation ditch being filled with water, and with that water a hoe and rolled shirt sleeves, was a people turning desert into orchards, greens from yellows and ochres, the monuments and temples. See, I can write drivel too. And I don't even get a $100,000 advance. So the problem are people who are not really thinking about understanding the business of making art, but are thinking about the movie rights and the romance. But, you know, it is like Dan said, and I think that Donna here, is Donna around? Donna could probably write a book about an artist, what it's really like after 20 years living with an artist, better than my couple of friends with their new books out. And it's just hard work. It's just reflexive. And I do 10, 20, 30, 40 of these. I have thousands of these. I've come back just recently. Okay, should we stay with these for a while?
Sure.
Okay. So, but basically, just even, we're at some border town in New Brunswick and sitting waiting while Donna ran into a shop. I'm sitting on the edge of a sidewalk, and I just pull out a tube of paint, and I don't even really look at, I don't care about what color it is. I just pull something out, and I might use one hand for my palette, and whatever brush I can find, I'll dip into it and paint. I see a couple of my former doctors here, and they now are nodding their heads and saying, yep, that's why I retired. And, but, it's just reflex. That's what you do, and you do it all day. So when I presented Dan with this project, and the best that he could do was to say, get off your ass and get down to work and finish these things. That was at a really low moment in my life, and it has propelled me. And when up right through just a handful of months ago, when our book was just going to press, and I couldn't possibly, that was just before I got sick. That was the desert in Morocco on another project. See, these are often done on the way.
Here, take one of them and I'll put the other one on the other
Most of
side.
my work, most of these were in service of a commission or a project, and nobody used to see these. But, so, recently, you may have read that just a few weeks ago, I got back from Nepal, and these are somewhat different in that I went and the assignment was to draw the high mountains, but of course, since I'm painting all day, I painted everything, and I came back with 150 or so of panels about this size, and I painted everything in sight. And it was the energy that Dan helped me gather from doing these little guys, finishing these off, that made me say yes to going, along with my neurologist who said, of course you should go. And it was an absolute humbling and exciting experience, and I'm having, even now, the time of my life, taking them into a larger format.
Henry's paintings, the little paintings are, in the book, I don't want to give too much away because you really got to read the book. The French have all kinds of words, like sketch, esquisse, ébauche, tableau, and these are all different things. And there's something called a pochade, and pochade in French means pocket. But when you see these painters going off with their little, like their little oil boxes, you go paint outside. What they're producing are things called pochades, these little tiny things. And it seemed the closest, because we just don't have the words to talk about sort of what Henry was doing. And the idea is that these were just possibilities. He was setting up, like maybe finding a gesture, a form, a structure, a motion within the work. This is like a story here. This is on a beach in Languedoc, France. And what drives the story of this day is the story of the beignet guy, right? And so the beignet, so Henry was not having a particularly terrific time. He wasn't feeling that well. And he's on the beach, and this sandy-colored guy with his sandy-colored beignets, which are donuts or fritters, comes onto the beach.
Are you singing now?
Beignet, chocolat, framboise, something like that.
With feeling.
I can sing with the guitar, but trust me, you don't want me to do it otherwise. And that turned around Henry's experience. And part of it was not just his personal experience, but the entire social aspect of it. So there's the beignet guy with his fritters on the beach. And Henry liked the song so much, he gave him another, I don't know, Gifon, whatever, to sing it again. And he did it again. And so pretty soon, the entire beach, everybody on the beach is singing the beignet song. And Henry loved it. And so there's a series of paintings that sort of come out of that. Now what's funny is, we're from Maine, which is why I talk with this wicked, slow Maine accent. And, the idea of landscape painting in Maine, people are going to just assume that it's Maine. We have beaches, and assume, this sort of but what goes into art, and this is, I want to try to do this quickly, but this is pretty interesting to me at least, and I think a lot of art people. What goes into art is very different than what we see as a viewing audience. So there's a big disconnect between the inspiration, the motivation, what energizes the artist, what they put into making their painting, and what people see. Artists are the worst ones to talk about this because they believe that the content of their work is what they were thinking about, what motivated them to make it in the first place. But that isn't necessarily true. You know, the content of the work is what we see, because of course it's mediated in the context of culture. Manet paints a naked woman with a black person sort of attending to her. And what that looked like to the people at the time is very different than what that would look like to us now. Or like when Florian Stettheimer paints a picture of a white woman sitting at a table being served by a black woman in the 1920s in New York. Those are really different things. But the content, how we see it right now, will constantly change. You know, the meaning of the Mona Lisa is very different now than what it was when, Da Vinci painted the Gioconda. So, getting back, I want to try to get back into where we are with Henry, but what he puts into his work, how it happens, how he engages with the public is cool, because it's not about just his little personal narrative of how brilliant he is and inspiration. He gets his inspiration from people, from art, from what's happening around him. He isn't the guy to walk in and say, oh my God, the light in here is amazing, and I've never seen it before, and nobody's ever done this. You know, that's not how it works for him. And I like that. So I'm trained as an art historian. So sometimes when I write about art, it's in this really nerdy context that goes way back, using sort of issues of, rhetoric and garbage and other languages that, matters at the time. And actually putting things in that context is very important. Other times, like when I write for magazines, I talk to the artists and do interviews, stuff like that, which is sort of the normal way we think about how we write about art. But I'm a critic, and as of last week, I literally just published 500 weeks in a row as the art critic for Portland Press Herald and the Maine Sunday Telegram, which is sort of crazy. I haven't missed a week. And yeah, it's weird. And if you knew me, you'd be like, how? That guy, no. But it's true. So when I write as an art critic, I'm not writing for the artist. I'm not writing for the gallery. I'm writing for the readership of the paper. I'm writing for the public. And so I don't care what the artists say. I don't care what the galleries say. And in fact, so what I do when I go to a show, the first thing I do is I go see the show without reading press releases, without reading the statements. I go and look at the work to see what the work says on its own, how it appears. And after you do this for a long time, you develop those muscles too. I can take anything an artist says and just ignore it. And it really does take practice. It's not so easy, A lot of people, somebody will point out in abstract painting, oh, that looks like a face, and it's hard for a lot of people to stop seeing that face because it's not there. But, so working with Henry is a pretty interesting combination of sort of like looking at the work, having the work stand on its own, talking about what sort of drives him and the level of engagement. And so when we, like when we were doing this book and the stories are happening, the storytelling aspects of how it rolls out is an incredibly cool way to get to know what's happening. And so like the Nepal aspect of like the Nepal paintings is fascinating, like the energy that goes into it. Now Henry took all these pieces that he made, that he structured, that looked like they could be finished, and he started rocking them. Henry's a really good painter. He's very successful and he's very well known, basically because his paintings are so appealing, they're gorgeous, and so it's easy to like them, they look nice, and he does, these works that are, they're appealing and attractive, but he's really good at pushing the paint around on the surface. So on these pieces, you can really see the brushwork, and it sort of offered him an opportunity to work in a mode where actually pushing the paint around on the surface is the thing that's really driving what we're looking at. So from an art critic standpoint, I love these works. From what he's doing and how these are the things that he does in place and time, they're fascinating. And then Henry's sort of healthy, humanistic, people-liking, sort of public respecting approach is really refreshing. And then when you add that together with an incredibly well-painted set of paintings that they're easy to like because they're gorgeous, it's been a pretty exciting project. So, and he's overly generous. Anything he says where I helped him do something, he works his butt off. He's really good.
There's one quick I'll try to make it quick, thing that I want to say, and it has to do with books. I continue to read a ridiculous amount. And during the time I did this painting, it's a painting of Aspen out west, I was reading Richard Powers' The Overstory, a fabulous book. I do recommend it. Aspen are a wonderful tree, and for those of you who have read it, you know that there's a large section of it that involves the communication between plants and trees and so on. And aspen are, not to, it's a theme that goes through it. Aspen communicate with each other very well. You can, and many New England trees, beech and our poplars, cousins of the aspen, do that well. When I thought a great deal about the Overstory when I was painting this image. I also thought about a question that Dan and I got in the last one, and I will leave it as a question and we should stop. We got a question in one of our presentations recently, or a couple months ago, I don't remember. It went something like this, that how can you trust these big ideas that you have? How can you try out these thoughts that you have and share them with your audience? How can you trust your audience with these ideas? Now, I may have butchered it. Did I butcher it?
No. Yeah. How did you come to trust your audience with your ideas?
I'm going to leave it there because I do trust my audience. I always trust my audience. And I'm going to just say thank you. We should move on, right? Namaste. Do we want questions?
Your Aspen picture? Here, I'm taking your Aspen picture.
With his shirt, it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable choice. Well, you'll see. Look at it.
Should we pass this one around too?
Sure.
Want to go a couple of questions?
Sure. Yes.
Mr. Isaacs, our family's enjoyed your work for many years. Thanks to Ava for introducing us to your work. You're familiar with your work.
I'm sorry.
Ava,
Among my issues is being deaf.
All right, well, my question is this. It wasn't until 6 weeks ago that I learned of your connection to Walter Gropius, thanks to your interview with the Financial Times.
Yes.
Could you, this is a question that you could spend the rest of the evening on, I don't want you to do that, nor do you want to, but could you just inform us a little bit about some of the influences of that experience you had in your life directly with your father that may have informed the direction you took as an artist?
That's huge.
You spent years in therapy over that.
No, I think I'm.
Just a small plate, please.
What I can tell you is this. In fact, I haven't even. Dan is going to be. I haven't even told Dan this, or my wife, but the Financial Times is following that article up with a series of articles following me through this year, and beginning with an exhibition that I'm having in Boothbay Harbor, and it appears that I'm returning to Nepal at some point. But anyway, my relationship to the Bauhaus was through my father and his many colleagues. My father was You know what? It's so big. I'm going to kindly ask that you write me. And my father was Gropius's first biographer. I spent much of my childhood surrounded by these, and they were mostly men, and some of them by chance were my teachers as well. But it's a very long story. If you go to my website, henryisaacs.com, it's easy to find me, but it's a huge chapter. I'm sorry.
Maybe that's the next book.
Well, actually, in this one, there's a little discussion about the Pollock in the hall. So, trust me, I won't spill the beans that your father was Jackson Pollock's intimate friend. And that's a code word with a whole bunch of winks. I don't know how to do that if I'm not typing. But yeah, so they had like 17 Jackson Pollocks in the house, you know, and Pollock would leave them there, and they were good friends. They would go wrestle on the beach. That his dad. Of course, to young Henry, Pollock was stinky, mean, and drunk. But when he opened his bedroom door, there was a Jackson Pollock, one which is in the National Gallery now, on the hallway. And so, whatever Henry thought of Pollock the man, there are all kinds of Pollock issues going on in the painting. So, like that Aspen painting he just showed you, those lines. So if you look at like Pollock's blue lines, or the piece that's in the National Gallery, where there's a figure on one side and a bunch of sort of organic things on the other. That's in Henry's work. So a lot of the growing up issues, the cultural development issues. Dad traveled to Mexico, and so Henry spent his time with David Siqueiros, you know, who didn't speak English, but for several days would just poke Henry to keep him awake to talk to him, because of course Henry's art teacher from up here in New England somewhere happened to be the anarchist general who was David Siqueiros' commander in this sort of like miniature anarchist uprising in Mexico, right? Spain, sorry. Oh, so, and that sounds like I'm just making it up, and I might be, but I'm not. So, any other questions? Comments? Concerns? Criticisms?
I think it may be a good time for people to purchase a book and bring it up and get it signed and